February 22, 2009, Athens, Greece, Korydallos Maximum Security Prison. A helicopter dropped from the winter sky. A rope ladder fell into the exercise yard. 2 men climbed up. Guards opened fire. And the craziest part? A woman on the helicopter fired back with an AK-47. This wasn't a movie. This was a Sunday afternoon in the most secure prison in Greece. And the man climbing that rope ladder, Vassilis Paleokostas, was about to do something no prisoner had ever done in history. He was about to escape from the same prison by helicopter for the second time. But this isn't just a story about 2 impossible escapes. It's about a poor mountain boy who became a folk hero by robbing banks and giving the money to peasants. It's about a kidnapping victim who praised his own kidnappers. And it's about the most wanted man in Europe, who has been free for 17 years, with a €1 million bounty on his head, and not a single person has turned him in. A man once ordered a helicopter pilot to land in a prison yard. The guards saw it happen. They did nothing. They thought he was an inspector. Vassilis Paleokostas was born on May 17, 1966, in a tiny mountain village called Moskofito in central Greece. The winters in those mountains were brutal. The summers were hot and dry. The houses had no heating. The roads were dirt. There was no work and no future. His family was poor. Even by Greek village standards, they were poor. He had an older brother named Nikos. The 2 boys grew up watching their father struggle to feed them. Their mother died young. Their grandmother helped raise them. They wore hand-me-down clothes. They walked to school in shoes that did not fit. They learned, very early, that life in the mountains was a fight you could lose. When Vassilis was old enough to work, the family moved down to the larger town of Trikala. He took a job at a cheese factory. He stood at a wooden table from sunrise to sunset, packing white blocks of feta into wooden crates. The work was hard. The pay was almost nothing. The smell of curdled milk stuck to his clothes and his skin. He was 13 years old. That same year, in 1979, he committed his first crime. He and his brother Nikos stole video equipment from a local shop. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning, and it taught him something important. It taught him that crime paid better than honest work. A single afternoon of stealing was worth more than a month at the cheese factory. He never went back to the cheese factory. By the time Vassilis was in his 20s, he had a mentor, a man named Kostas Samaras. The Greek criminal underworld called him the artist. Samaras taught the Paleokostas brothers how to plan a robbery, how to scout a target, how to disappear afterward. He taught them that the difference between a small-time thief and a professional was discipline. The Paleokostas brothers learned fast. They graduated from petty theft to jewelry stores, from jewelry stores to armored cars, from armored cars to banks. And in one early jewelry store robbery, they did something so audacious it became a local legend. They locked the police inside their own police station, just chained the doors shut from the outside, so the cops could not respond to the alarm. Then, in 1992, they pulled off the biggest job of their lives. The town was called Kalimbaka. It sat at the foot of the famous Meteora monasteries in central Greece, the towering rock formations where monks had lived for centuries in stone cells carved into the cliffs. The bank in Kalimbaka held 260 million Greek drachmas in its vault. That was an enormous amount of money in 1992, more than most Greek workers would earn in 100 lifetimes. The Paleokostas brothers and Samaras hid it in broad daylight. They walked in carrying weapons. They walked out carrying cash. The whole job took less than 10 minutes. They left no fingerprints. They left no witnesses who could identify them. They walked out with every drachma they could carry. It was the largest bank robbery in Greek history at that point, and it would remain so for years. On the drive away from Kalimbaka, the radio came on. The news was already reporting the crime. The reporter said the gang had escaped with 170 million drachmas, leaving 90 million behind in the vault. Vassilis turned to his brother and said calmly, "We left 90 million. Should we go back and get the rest?" He was joking. Probably. But here is where the Vassilis Paleokostas story stops looking like a normal crime story. Because Vassilis did something with that money that no other bank robber in Europe had ever done. He gave most of it away. He drove back into the mountains. He found poor farmers. He found struggling families. He found widows who could not afford to bury their husbands. He found old men who had lost their pensions to the inflation crisis. He handed them stacks of cash, no conditions, no expectations. He told them to feed their children. He told them to fix their roofs. He told them to forget where the money came from. The villagers called him Robin of the Poor. They told stories about him in coffee shops. They protected him when police came asking questions. They gave him food and a place to sleep. When his face appeared on wanted posters in the village squares, the posters mysteriously disappeared by morning. The villagers had decided, collectively and silently, that Vassilis Paleokostas was one of them. He had not abandoned them, so they would not abandon him. Greece in the early 1990s was a country in crisis. Inflation was crushing ordinary people. Government corruption was rampant. The banks were owned by the political elite. To rob a bank in Greece in 1992 was to rob the same people who had been robbing the country for decades. And to give that money back to the villagers, that made Vassilis Paleokostas something more than a criminal. It made him a hero. In his autobiography, written years later, Vassilis explained his personal code. He wrote that his conscience forbade him from selling guns, from extorting small businesses, from selling drugs, from breaking into private homes, from killing the elderly, from cooperating with police or politicians. So what did his conscience allow? Robbing banks, kidnapping the rich, and working toward a more just world. That last part would matter later. In 1995, Vassilis and his crew kidnapped Alexander Haitoglu, the CEO of one of Greece's largest food companies. They held him for ransom. They treated him politely. They fed him well. They talked with him. They asked about his family. When Haitoglu was finally released, after the ransom was paid, he said something to reporters that nobody expected. He said, with a small smile, "Gentlemen, if it weren't so expensive, I would love to have another adventure with you." The kidnapping victim praised his kidnappers. How does a criminal earn that kind of reaction? How does a man who robs banks and kidnaps executives become a hero to both his victims and the public? The answer is what makes Vassilis Paleokostas different from every other prisoner in this story, and it is also what made his next chapter inevitable. In 1999, Vassilis was driving on a rural road late at night. He had been drinking. He lost control of the car. The crash was loud enough to attract attention. The police arrived. They recognized him. He was arrested on the spot. In 2000, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the Haitoglu kidnapping. He was sent to Korydallos prison in Athens, the most secure facility in Greece. He would spend the next 6 years trying to escape. Korydallos Maximum Security Prison sits in a densely populated suburb on the western edge of Athens. It was built in 1963. It has high concrete walls, metal watchtowers, and armed guards at every gate. It is surrounded by apartment buildings, schools, and busy streets. It is also famous for being one of the harshest prisons in Europe. The cells are overcrowded, the guards are understaffed and underpaid. Violence between inmates is common. The walls are stained, the lights flicker, and once you go inside Korydallos, you do not come out. Unless your name is Vassilis Paleokostas. For 6 years, Vassilis studied the prison. He studied the schedules, he studied the guards, he studied the walls. He attempted multiple escapes. They all failed. The walls were too high. The guards were too many. The doors were too thick. Then he had an idea so simple and so insane that nobody had ever tried it before. If you cannot go through the walls, go over them. Not by climbing, by flying. He sent a message to his brother Nikos, who was still on the outside. The message was passed through visitors, through letters, through smuggled phones. The plan took months to develop. Nikos and his accomplices began studying helicopter tour companies in Athens. They looked at flight paths. They looked at landing zones. They flew over Korydallos themselves, posing as tourists, mapping every inch of the exercise yard. They discovered something incredible. The Greek prison system had no protocol for what to do if a helicopter approached the prison. No air defense, no anti-aircraft procedures, no instructions for the guards. If a helicopter were to land in the exercise yard, the guards would simply assume it belonged to a senior official. This was the weakness Vassilis needed. The afternoon of June 4th, 2006, 2 men walked into the offices of a helicopter tour company in Agios Kosmas, a coastal suburb of Athens. They paid 1,400 euros in cash for a sightseeing flight over the city. They were polite, they were calm. They looked like ordinary tourists. The pilot started the engine. The blades began to spin. The helicopter lifted off the ground and headed north toward the city. 5 minutes into the flight, the two men pulled out a pistol and a hand grenade. They told the pilot to fly to Korydallos prison. They told him not to make any sudden movements. They told him exactly where to land. The pilot's hands shook on the controls. He had no choice. He turned the helicopter toward the prison. Inside Korydallos, it was exercise hour. Hundreds of prisoners were in the yard. Some were walking laps. Some were lifting weights. Vassilis Paleokostas was one of them. He was wearing his prison clothes. He had a small bag at his feet. He looked up at the sky. He had been waiting 6 years for this moment. The helicopter appeared over the prison wall. It hovered for a moment. Then it began to descend, right into the middle of the exercise yard. The guards in the towers saw it land. They watched the blades spin. They watched the dust swirl. And they did exactly what Vassilis had predicted they would do. They did nothing. They thought it was the warden. They thought it was a senior official from the Ministry of Justice. They thought it was a prison inspector arriving for a surprise visit. Some of them straightened their uniforms. Some of them adjusted their hats. They wanted to look professional. They did not want to be reprimanded. Vassilis Paleokostas walked across the yard. He was joined by another prisoner, an Albanian inmate named AK-47, who was serving a life sentence for murder. The two of them walked calmly toward the helicopter. They did not run. Running would have raised suspicion. They walked. They reached the helicopter. They climbed inside. The door closed behind them. The blades spun faster. Then, a guard in the tower realized something was wrong. He shouted into his radio. He raised his rifle. He fired. But the helicopter was already lifting off the ground. The first bullets missed completely. The second bullets clipped the side of the fuselage, but did no damage. The third volley went wide as the helicopter rose above the prison wall and tilted forward into the Athens sky. Within seconds, it was gone. The helicopter flew low over the city. It headed for a cemetery in Schisto, on the outskirts of Athens. It landed in an open clearing. Vassilis and Rizai jumped out. 2 motorcycles were waiting in the trees. They climbed on. They rode away. The pilot was left tied up in the helicopter, alive and unharmed. When police arrived, he told them everything. He had been forced. He had no choice. He was a victim. It was the first helicopter prison break in Greek history, and it had taken less than 4 minutes from landing to liftoff. Within hours, Vassilis Paleokostas was the most famous man in Greece. The Greek press exploded. Television crews surrounded the prison. Politicians demanded answers. The justice minister stood in front of cameras and promised that this would never happen again. He promised that security at Korydallos would be increased. He promised that helicopter protocols would be implemented immediately. He promised investigations. He promised punishments. The Greek public, however, had a different reaction. They cheered. In the cafes of Athens, in the villages of the mountains, in the working-class neighborhoods of Piraeus, ordinary Greeks raised their glasses to the man who had flown out of the most secure prison in the country. The folk hero had become a legend. The Robin Hood of the poor had escaped the rich man's prison. It felt, to many Greeks, like a small victory in a long fight against a system they did not trust. Vassilis Paleokostas remained free for 2 years and 2 months. During that time, he didn't lay low. He kept working. In June 2008, he organized the kidnapping of Georgos Malonis, a wealthy Greek industrialist. Malonis was held for 13 days. His family paid the ransom. He was released unharmed. But every day on the run is a day closer to being caught. And on August 2nd, 2008, Vassilis Paleokostas was tracked down by Greek police in the northern city of Thessaloniki. He was arrested without a fight. He was placed in a different maximum security prison while he awaited trial. His trial date was set for February 23, 2009. The charge? Escaping from Korydallos prison. 2 days before the trial, on February 21, 2009, the Greek prison system did something so stupid, it almost feels intentional. They transferred Vassilis Paleokostas back to Korydallos. the same prison he had escaped from. They put him in the same wing, with the same exercise yard, with the same AK-47, who had also been recaptured. They let the two of them exercise together. The Justice Minister had promised 3 years earlier that helicopter escapes would never happen again at Korydallos. He had not kept his promise. Sunday afternoon, February 22, 2009, the day before the trial. Across central Greece, in the small mountain town of Atia, a couple walked into another helicopter tour company. The woman did most of the talking. She said she was a businesswoman. She had chartered flights from this same company several times in the previous weeks. She was a regular customer. The pilots knew her face, they knew her voice, they knew her smile. She told the pilot she wanted to fly to Athens. The man with her was quiet. The pilot did not ask questions. He had flown her before. There was no reason to be suspicious. The helicopter lifted off from Atia and headed south. 20 minutes into the flight, the woman pulled out an AK-47 assault rifle. The man pulled out a hand grenade. They told the pilot to fly low. They told him to avoid radar. They told him to head for Korydallos prison. The pilot's face went white. He understood immediately what was happening. He had read the news 3 years ago. Everyone in Greece had. He knew what they were going to do. He knew that 2 men had escaped from Korydallos prison by helicopter in 2006. He knew that the same 2 men had been recaptured. He knew that today was the day before their trial. He realized he was not flying to Athens. He was flying into history. He did exactly what they told him to do. The helicopter dropped to treetop level. It skimmed across the suburbs of western Athens. It approached Korydallos from the north, flying so low that residents in nearby apartment buildings could see the rotor blades through their kitchen windows. Children pointed at the sky. Mothers pulled them back from balconies. It rose over the prison wall. In the exercise yard below, the Vassilis Paleokostas and AK-47 were waiting. They had received word through smuggled phones the night before. They knew the helicopter was coming. They knew the time. They knew the spot. They had walked to that exact spot in the yard at the exact moment, casually, as if they were just stretching their legs. They looked up. The helicopter hovered above the yard. The door slid open. A long rope ladder dropped down. It uncoiled in the air and hit the ground with a slap. This time, the guards reacted immediately. They had been trained. They had been warned. They had been told, over and over for the last 3 years, that this exact moment might come. They raised their rifles. They fired. The first bullets cracked through the air. They missed the helicopter. They missed the ladder. They missed the 2 men running across the yard. Vassilis grabbed the ladder. He started climbing. Rizai grabbed the ladder. He started climbing. The guards kept firing. The bullets were getting closer now. 1 round struck the side of the helicopter. Another punched through the gas tank. Fuel began to leak in a thin stream from the underside of the aircraft. The pilot heard the impact and felt the aircraft shake violently. He knew, immediately, that the helicopter would not make it back to the airfield. The 2 men were halfway up the ladder. They were swinging in the wind. They were exposed. They were going to die. And then the woman in the helicopter raised her AK-47. She leaned out the open door. She braced herself against the frame. She aimed down at the guard towers, and she pulled the trigger. The AK-47 roared. Bullets sprayed across the prison yard. Sparks flew off the metal of the watchtowers. The guards ducked behind cover. Their fire stopped. The few seconds of silence was enough. Vassilis reached the door of the helicopter. He pulled himself inside. Rizai was right behind him. The pilot pulled up on the controls. The helicopter rose unsteadily into the sky, leaking fuel from the punctured gas tank, the rotor blades chopping at the cold winter air. Below, in the exercise yard, the other prisoners began to cheer. Hundreds of them. Hardened criminals, lifers, men who had not smiled in years. They were all looking up at the sky. They were all clapping. They were all shouting. They had just witnessed the impossible. Twice. From the same prison, by the same man. One guard later told reporters that the cheering was the worst part. Not the helicopter, not the AK-47, not the broken procedures, the cheering. The sound of his own prisoners celebrating his failure. The helicopter limped north. It could not stay in the air for long. Fuel was pouring out. The pilot had to make an emergency landing on a highway clearing north of Athens. As soon as the skids touched the ground, Vassilis, Rizai, and the woman jumped out. The pilot was tied up, gagged, and a hood was placed over his head. He was left in the helicopter, alive. 3 motorcycles were waiting in the trees. They climbed on. They disappeared into the mountains. A neighbor recorded the helicopter on a home video camera as it flew away from the prison. The footage went viral within hours. By Sunday evening, hundreds of people had joined Facebook fan clubs celebrating Vassilis Paleokostas. The most popular one was named, simply, Paleokostas, Korydallos, 2-0. It read like a soccer score, the man versus the prison, and the man was winning. The Greek government collapsed in fury. The justice minister fired the inspector general of prisons. He fired the warden of Korydallos. He fired 3 prison guards. He fired the head of the ministry's prison security division. He suspended the head of prison policy. He ordered an investigation into the bank accounts of every guard who had worked in Vassilis's wing. The prime minister called an emergency meeting. The justice minister called the escape an insult I do not accept. A €1 million bounty was placed on Vassilis Paleokostas' head. And the Greek people, watching all of this on the evening news, raised their glasses again. The man who would not be caught had done it again. Alkit Rizai was recaptured in November 2009. He was returned to Korydallos. In 2013, he took 5 prison guards hostage during another escape attempt. That attempt failed. He is still in Korydallos today. Vassilis Paleokostas was never caught. For 17 years, he has been a ghost. The BBC published a long-form investigation in 2014 titled The Uncatchable. Journalist Jeff Maish traveled to Athens, to Trikala, to the mountain villages where Vassilis grew up. He interviewed Vassilis' father. He interviewed the priest from his village. He interviewed Kostas Samaras, the mentor, from inside another Greek prison. He interviewed Alkit Rizai. Everyone talked. Nobody knew where Vassilis was. Rizai gave one of the most striking quotes of the entire investigation. From his prison cell in Korydallos, he told the BBC reporter exactly how the helicopter escapes had been planned. He said, "We considered hiring a pilot, but a scared pilot is better." Then he added, with a smile that the reporter could hear in his voice, "The ultimate aim in a jailbreak is to leave nice and pretty, and to say cheers and bravo as you leave." That was the philosophy of the Paleokostas escapes, not just to get out beautifully. The BBC concluded that Vassilis was probably still in Greece, probably still in the mountains where he was born, probably protected by villagers who remembered the cash he had handed them in the 1990s. Wigs and women's clothing were found in one of his hideouts, suggesting he could disguise himself as a woman when needed. Police believed he had also undergone plastic surgery to alter his face. In June 2010, a mail bomb arrived at the office of the Greek Minister of Public Order. It killed his assistant. Police found Vassilis' fingerprint on a fragment of the bomb. He was reclassified from criminal to terrorist. In 2021, Vassilis Paleokostas published an autobiography. He titled it A Normal Life. It was published in Greek by a small press, then translated into English by Freedom Press, an anarchist publisher in London. The book became a bestseller in Greece within weeks. It was written, somehow, from his hiding place. Nobody knows how the manuscript reached the publisher. In 2023, a podcast about his life reached the top 10 of Spotify in the United States within 48 hours of release. The Greek government has spent millions of euros searching for him. Interpol has him on its most wanted list. The bounty on his head, €1 million, would be enough to change a poor Greek family's life forever. Nobody has turned him in. Most prison escape stories end with a body. The escapee is caught. He is shot. He is sent back to a deeper, darker cell. He becomes a footnote. Vassilis Paleokostas is not a footnote. He is the only man in history to escape from the same prison by helicopter twice. He is the only man in modern Europe to humiliate an entire government and walk away. He is the only fugitive in the age of facial recognition, satellite surveillance, and Interpol databases to remain free for nearly 2 decades while becoming a published author and a podcast subject. His brother Nikos was sentenced to 197 years plus 376 months in prison. After 16 years behind bars in the Patras State Penitentiary, Nikos was released to house arrest due to poor health. The mentor, Kostas Samaras, gave one final interview to the BBC from his prison cell. He smiled when asked about Vassilis. He would not say where he was. Somewhere in the mountains of central Greece, or perhaps in a quiet village in the south, or perhaps across the border in another country entirely, a 59-year-old man with a possibly altered face is reading a book or tending to a garden or walking along a quiet road. He is the most wanted man in Greece. He has been free for 6,250 days. He has flown out of a maximum security prison twice. He has stolen from the rich and given to the poor. He has been called a hero, a terrorist, a Robin Hood, and a ghost. And every morning, in the offices of the Greek Ministry of Justice, the file marked Paleokostas Vassilis is still open, still active, still waiting. The score remains the same. Paleokostas, 2. Korydallos, 0. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.